There is a photograph taken in 1972. Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, stands alone at the edge of a freshly dug grave at Frogmore. She is 80 years old. She is wearing black. She is holding herself together with the same iron discipline she has deployed for 6 decades. And she is watching the coffin of the man who gave up the British Empire for her being lowered into the frozen English earth. That should be the end of the story. The final act of the greatest love story ever told. Except, if you look closely at that photograph, you will notice something deeply unsettling. She is not weeping. She is not clinging to anyone for support. She is standing apart, rigid, a woman carved from marble. And on her face, behind the veil, there is no devastation. There is something else entirely. Something that looks, if you dare to name it, like the faint, guilty flicker of relief. Everyone knows the myth of Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American adventuress who lured a king away from his throne, the woman for whom Edward VIII threw away an empire. We have been sold this story as romance for nearly a century. But what if the romance was actually a prison? What if the woman who took a king never actually wanted to keep him? What if, buried beneath the Cartier bracelets and the Parisian gowns, there was a woman who spent 40 years silently screaming to be let out of the gilded cage she had accidentally locked herself into? Her name was Bessie Wallis Warfield, and this is not the story of the woman who stole a king. This is the story of the woman who was devoured by him. The girl from Baltimore with nothing to lose. Bessie Wallis Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. But that pastoral name is deceptive. She was not born into the gilded world she would later inhabit. She was born just on the periphery of it, close enough to see the light, but not quite close enough to feel the warmth. Her father, Teakle Wallis Warfield, was a man of charm and very little commercial sense. He was the youngest son of a prominent Maryland family, a man who had been given every advantage and had squandered most of them. He had a beautiful speaking voice, a gentle manner, and absolutely no head for business. He died of tuberculosis when Wallis was just 5 months old, leaving her mother, Alice Montague, a woman of great social pride and very modest means, utterly dependent on the charity of a wealthier uncle. His name was Solomon Davies Warfield, and he was the embodiment of Baltimore's old guard. He was a bachelor, a railroad magnate, a man who lived by rigid rules and expected everyone around him to live by them too. He provided for his widowed sister-in-law and her child, but he never let them forget that they were dependents. He paid for the roof, but he charged for it in dignity. He controlled the purse strings, and he controlled their social life. He decided where they would live, what schools Wallis would attend, and what was appropriate behavior. And he made it abundantly clear that Wallis's mother, Alice, had made a disastrous marriage to a charming failure, and that Wallis must never, ever repeat that mistake. She grew up in a brownstone on East Biddle Street, a world away from the horse farms of the true Baltimore elite, but close enough to smell the privilege. She could see the girls from the Roland Park set driving past in their carriages. She could hear the laughter from the country club dances to which she was not invited. She was a Warfield, yes, but she was the poor Warfield, the one who had to wear hand-me-down dresses that had been carefully altered to look new, the one who had to smile extra brightly to compensate for the fact that her mother couldn't afford to host the same lavish parties as the other ladies. She learned early that charm was currency. If you couldn't buy your way in, you could smile your way in. You could listen your way in. You could make yourself so agreeable, so fascinating, so indispensable that people forgot you didn't quite belong. She grew up in a Baltimore defined by a rigid, almost theatrical social hierarchy. It was the kind of place where your worth was measured not by what you did, but by where you sat at dinner. The Blue Book of Baltimore society was the Bible, and the Warfields were in it. But Wallis and her mother were the footnotes, not the main text. Wallis was not the prettiest girl in the room. She knew this. She studied her face in the mirror with a critical, unsentimental eye. She was too angular, her jaw too strong, her gaze too sharp. She lacked the soft, dimpled prettiness that was fashionable in the Edwardian era. But she had something that, in that particular era, was far more dangerous than beauty. She had a ferocious, almost masculine wit, and a discipline that bordered on mania. She understood the rules of the game before anyone else even realized a game was being played. She knew how to listen, how to flatter, and how to make a man feel like he was the most fascinating creature on God's green earth. She attended Oldfield School, the most fashionable girls' school in Maryland, a place nestled in the rolling hills of Glencoe, where the daughters of the Southern gentry were polished into ladies. She was not the richest girl there, not by a long shot. Some of her classmates arrived with trunks full of Parisian gowns. Wallis arrived with a steely determination to outshine them all. She learned that money could buy furniture, but only discipline could buy posture. And Wallis had posture. She learned to iron her ribbons until they lay flat, and to hold a teacup as if she were posing for a portrait, even when no one was watching. She studied the way the most popular girls walked, talked, and tilted their heads. She was a student of human behavior, and her subject was how to belong. She was preparing for a life that by all accounts she had no right to expect. She was a girl from the edges, pretending she belonged at the center, and she did it so convincingly that eventually the center started to believe her. The first marriage and the education in survival. In 1916, she married Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a handsome, square-jawed U.S. Navy aviator. He was a pilot in the early days of aviation, a profession that carried with it a whiff of glamour and danger. He was one of the first men to fly planes off the decks of ships, a pioneer in a field that was as likely to kill him as make him a hero. It was supposed to be the first step up the ladder. It was supposed to be the escape from the Baltimore brownstone and the disapproving glare of Uncle Saul. Wallis saw in Win Spencer a ticket to a broader world. He was dashing. He wore the uniform well. He represented adventure. And for a girl who had spent her entire life within the suffocating confines of Baltimore society, adventure was intoxicating. They were married in a small ceremony, and Wallis believed she had finally secured her future. She was wrong. The adventure turned into a nightmare almost immediately. Win Spencer was a drunk, not the charming, tipsy kind of drunk, but the cruel, erratic, lock the door and break the china kind. The kind of drunk who would be the life of the party one moment and a raging monster the next. When he was sober, he could be charming. He could be witty. He could make Wallis laugh. But the sobriety never lasted. He was a product of the military drinking culture of the time, where hard drinking was seen as a sign of masculinity, and where the pressures of early aviation drove many pilots to the bottle. But more than that, he was a man deeply insecure and prone to fits of violent jealousy. He was jealous of her wit. He was jealous of her ability to command a room. He was jealous of any man who looked at her twice. He would hide bottles around the house, in the back of closets, behind books on shelves. He would disappear for days on benders, leaving Wallis alone in whatever naval town they were stationed in, with no money, no friends, and no explanation. He would humiliate her in front of guests, making cutting remarks about her appearance or her background. He would apologize the next day with tears and promises, and she would believe him, because she wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that she had made a catastrophic mistake. And in the first of many ironies that would define Wallis's life, she learned to survive by controlling the environment around her. She learned that if she could just keep the room perfect, if she could just manage the details, the chaos might stay at bay. She became obsessed with order. The napkins had to be folded precisely. The silver had to gleam. Her own appearance had to be immaculate, even if she had been crying all night. It was a coping mechanism, a way to exert control over a life that was spinning wildly out of control. She spent years moving from naval base to naval base, from San Diego to Washington, D.C., from Pensacola to Coronado, trying to hold together the facade of a marriage. She became expert at packing and unpacking a household in record time. She became expert at making excuses for her husband's absences. She became expert at smiling when she wanted to scream. Behind closed doors, the fights were escalating. There are accounts of him locking her in her room, of her having to flee to the homes of friends in the middle of the night, of her sitting in train stations with a single suitcase, trying to decide if she had the courage to leave for good. It was an isolating, terrifying existence, and it taught Wallis a hard lesson about men and about dependency. She learned that a man's promise of security could evaporate overnight. She learned that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. She left him, went back, left him again. This pattern repeated itself multiple times over several years. There were separations and reconciliations, each one more damaging than the last. She spent time living with her mother in Washington, D.C., licking her wounds and trying to figure out what to do next. She had a brief, intense relationship with a charming Argentine diplomat named Felipe Espil, a man who showed her what it was like to be treated with kindness and respect. But Espil's family disapproved of a divorced American, and that relationship ended in heartbreak. Wallis finally secured a divorce from Win Spencer in 1927, after years of legal wrangling and emotional exhaustion. She was bruised, but she was not broken. She was a woman in her early 30s with no fortune, a failed marriage, and a reputation that was, in the eyes of Baltimore society, slightly tarnished. She was a survivor, but she was also desperate for the safety net she never had as a child. She needed stability. She needed something solid. She needed a man who would not drink, who would not rage, who would simply be there. And that is when she met Ernest Simpson, the quiet Englishman and the move to London. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was the opposite of Win Spencer in almost every conceivable way. He was steady, kind, intellectually curious, and he worked in the family shipping business, Simpson, Spence, and Young. He was half British, half American, and entirely decent. He had been born in New York but educated in England, and he moved between the two worlds with an easy, unassuming grace. He was not flashy. He was not a prince. He was a businessman who liked a good book, a quiet dinner, and a thoughtful conversation about art or politics. He was exactly what Wallis thought she needed. He was a safe harbor after years of stormy seas. He was calm where Win had been chaotic. He was reliable where Win had been unpredictable. When Wallis met him at a party in New York, she recognized in him something she had never truly experienced: stability without suffocation. He admired her intelligence. He didn't try to dim her light. He just wanted to share a life with her. They married in 1928 at the Chelsea Registry Office in London. It was a quiet affair, the wedding of two practical people starting a new chapter. There were no grand flourishes, no society page spectacles, just two people who seemed well suited to each other. And for a while, it was good. In fact, it was very good. They settled into a comfortable life in a flat at 5 Bryanston Court, near Marble Arch. The flat was modest by the standards of the British upper class, but Wallis transformed it into a jewel box of taste and precision. She arranged the furniture. She chose the fabrics. She managed the small staff. She was, for the first time in her adult life, the mistress of her own domain, and she reveled in it. Ernest was devoted to her. He was proud of her wit, her style, her ability to run a home with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. He would come home from the office, and she would have a cocktail waiting, the apartment glowing with candlelight, the conversation sparkling. They were not in the top tier of London society, but they were comfortably in the middle of it, hosting dinner parties for Americans abroad and mid-level British businessmen. It was a life of taste and comfort, if not exactly passion. And for Wallis, after the passion of Win Spencer had nearly destroyed her, a lack of passion felt like a blessing. But here is the twist of fate that changes everything. It is 1930. Wallis is content. She has a good husband, a nice flat, a solid place in the middle rung of London society. And then she meets a friend of a friend, a glamorous woman named Thelma Furness. And Thelma makes a casual request. She has to go to America for a few weeks. She needs someone to keep an eye on the little man. The little man she is referring to is David, the Prince of Wales. This is the moment where the trapdoor opens. Wallis Simpson does not go hunting for a king. The king is handed to her like a piece of luggage to be watched over for a fortnight. And it is in those few weeks, alone with a lonely, emotionally stunted prince in the drawing rooms of Fort Belvedere, that Wallis does what she does best. She listens, she teases, she tidies, and without realizing it, she steps into a snare that will never release her. She thinks she is doing a favor for a friend. She is actually sealing the rest of her life in a velvet coffin. The man who would be king. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Edward was. He was not just a prince. He was a phenomenon. The eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary, he was the most photographed man on the planet. He was the poster boy for a generation that had survived the First World War and was desperate for something modern, something bright. He was blonde, slight, with a permanent expression of melancholy behind his smile. He was a trendsetter. He wore bold, colorful sweaters and +4s on the golf course. He championed modern causes. He visited the poor in the coal mining villages of Wales and uttered the famous phrase, "Something must be done." He seemed to care. He seemed to be a break from the stuffy, rigid monarchy of his father. The public adored him. Women threw themselves at him. He was the golden boy of the empire. But behind the public image, behind the golden hair and the easy smile, was a man of profound emotional immaturity. Raised in the stifling, rigid court of his father, where he was bullied and belittled, David never developed an adult identity. His father, George V, was a gruff naval officer who thought showing emotion was a sign of weakness. He believed that children should be seen and not heard, and preferably not seen very much either. He was a stickler for discipline and punctuality, and he found his eldest son to be frivolous, weak, and deeply disappointing. His mother, Queen Mary, was a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to the preservation of the crown. She collected Fabergé eggs and antique furniture, and she treated her children like artifacts that needed to be dusted and positioned correctly. They were not hugged. They were inspected. David's childhood was spent in a series of vast, cold rooms, supervised by nannies who were often cruel and neglectful. He was starved of warmth, desperate for attention, and utterly incapable of being alone. He had been sent to Naval College, where he was bullied mercilessly. He had been sent to Oxford, where he felt out of his depth. He had served in the war, but he had been kept away from the real fighting, which only added to his sense of inadequacy. He was a man who had been given everything except the one thing he truly needed, the feeling that he was enough, just as he was. By the time he met Wallis, he was in his late 30s, but emotionally, he was a teenager. He was bored by his duties. He loathed the red boxes full of state papers that arrived every morning. He found the endless round of ceremonies and investitures mind-numbingly dull. He was restless, searching for a purpose, and he was a serial womanizer, but not in the confident, predatory sense. He was a man who wanted to be absorbed. He wanted a woman who was also a mother, a drill sergeant, and a best friend. He wanted someone to run the show. He wanted someone to tell him what to wear, what to eat, what to think. He had been searching for that person his entire adult life. He thought he had found it in Thelma Furness, but Thelma was too flighty, too independent, too much a creature of her own world. And then came Wallis Simpson. Wallis, with her American efficiency, her refusal to be impressed by his title, and her almost brutal directness, was the first woman who seemed capable of doing just that. She created an environment for him that he had never known, an environment of warmth, of gaiety, and of absolute, unquestioning order. She ran his life the way she ran her own, with precision, with discipline, and with a fierce, protective love. For a man who had spent his life wandering the cold corridors of Buckingham Palace, Wallis Simpson's drawing room felt like home. He fell in love, not a balanced adult love, but a consuming, desperate, obsessive love. He wanted her to be his wife, his partner, his entire world. And he did not care what it cost. The rise of the mistress and the fall of the crown. The years between 1931 and 1936 were a slow-burning fuse, leading to an explosion that no one in the establishment saw coming, or at least no one believed would actually detonate. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and Wallis Simpson deepened with astonishing speed. Ernest Simpson, the cuckolded husband, was shunted aside. He was a decent man caught in a cyclone. He continued to work, to provide for his household, while his wife spent more and more time at the fort, a house near Windsor Great Park that the prince had taken over for entertaining. The fort was a deliberate creation, a world away from the formality of royal residences, where David could surround himself with his own friends and his own rules. And Wallis was its undisputed queen. She redecorated. She planned the menus. She managed the guest lists. She was, in effect, acting as the prince's hostess, his social secretary, and his emotional support system. Ernest was often there too, a ghost at the feast, a witness to his own displacement. The three of them even went on vacations together, a bizarre Edwardian menage that worked only because Ernest was too polite and too stunned to stop it. He was a gentleman, and gentlemen did not make scenes. So he watched as his wife became the center of the Prince of Wales's universe. Eventually, the strain became too much. Wallis divorced him. It was a quiet, discreet divorce, granted in Ipswich under British law. The grounds were the standard ones of the era, but everyone in the room knew the real reason. Wallis was clearing the decks. She was preparing for the main event. And then, in January 1936, King George V died. The old king, who had been a symbol of stability and tradition, was gone. Edward was now King Edward VIII. The accession to the throne changed everything. Suddenly, Wallis Simpson was no longer just the American friend of a playboy prince. She was the companion of the King Emperor, the man who ruled over a quarter of the globe. The British press, bound by an unspoken gentleman's agreement, maintained a blackout on the story. Not a word was printed in the United Kingdom. The newspaper proprietors, men like Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, had agreed to keep the king's relationship out of the papers, believing that a public scandal would be too damaging to the monarchy. But across the Atlantic, the American newspapers were having a field day. They screamed headlines about the king's Wally. They printed photographs of her on the king's yacht. They speculated wildly about the nature of their relationship. The British establishment, the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the king's own family, was reading those papers smuggled into the country, and their blood ran cold. Wallis Simpson was a twice-divorced American. More than that, both her previous husbands were still living. In the eyes of the Church of England, of which the king was the supreme governor, this was an impossibility. She could not be queen. She could not even be married to the king in a church ceremony. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, a man of granite propriety and deep political instincts, tried to reason with the king. He explained the constitutional crisis that was brewing. He explained that the governments of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, would never accept Wallis as queen. He offered compromises, perhaps a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would be the king's wife, but not the queen. She would have a lesser title. Her children, if there were any, would not be in the line of succession. Edward refused. It was all or nothing. For Edward, Wallis was not a political problem to be solved. She was his oxygen. He could not function without her. He could not read the state papers without her. He could not make decisions without her. He had handed over the entirety of his emotional and executive functioning to this woman from Baltimore. He told Baldwin, "I am going to marry Mrs. Simpson, and if I can't marry her as king, I will abdicate." Baldwin was stunned. He had assumed the king would come to his senses. He had assumed the weight of the crown would force a compromise. He had underestimated the depth of Edward's dependency. But here is the part of the story that is almost never told, the part that reveals the true nature of the trap Wallis was in. In the autumn of 1936, as the crisis reached its boiling point, Wallis Simpson did something extraordinary. She tried to run. She didn't just write a letter. She didn't just plead with him over the phone. She fled to France, and then, in a desperate, secret move, she attempted to disappear entirely. Through an intermediary, she contacted the British government and offered a deal. She would vanish. She would leave Europe. She would never contact the king again. She would sign a legally binding agreement to stay away forever. All she asked in return was that Edward be allowed to keep his throne and that his reputation be protected. She was willing to erase herself from history to save him from himself. And the British government, Stanley Baldwin's office, considered it. But there was one problem: Edward. When word of Wallis's offer reached the king, he went into a frenzy. He sent a message back, not to the government, but to Wallis. And the message was chilling in its simplicity. He told her that if she disappeared, he would find her. He would abdicate anyway. And he would spend the rest of his life sitting on her doorstep, a living monument to her cruelty. He would make sure the entire world knew she had destroyed him. He didn't threaten her with violence. He threatened her with visibility. He threatened to make her the villain of the century, unless she came back and played the role of the happy bride. And Wallis, exhausted, terrified, and seeing no way out, came back. She walked back into the cage because the alternative was to be hunted for the rest of her life by a king without a crown and without a purpose. She didn't steal the king. The king kidnapped her future. On December 10th, 1936, King Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. He had been king for just 325 days. It was the shortest reign of any British monarch since the disputed reign of Lady Jane Grey 4 centuries earlier. He signed the document in the presence of his 3 brothers, who were all, in their own ways, horrified. The following night, he gave a radio address to the nation from Windsor Castle. His voice, slightly high-pitched and nervous, crackled over the airwaves. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. He spoke of his brother, the new King George VI, and asked the nation to give him their loyalty. And then he was gone, exiled, a king without a throne. Wallis listened to that broadcast from a villa in Cannes, France, hiding from the mobs of reporters. She was surrounded by a few close friends, but she was utterly alone. And as she listened to his voice, she knew that the door she had just walked through had slammed shut behind her forever. She had won. She had captured the heart of a king so completely that he had given up an empire for her. But winning had made her the most hated woman in the English-speaking world. She was blamed for the abdication. She was blamed for the crisis. She was blamed for the burden now placed on the shoulders of the reluctant, stammering new king, George VI. And she was now, irrevocably, chained to a man who had just given up everything for her, which meant she could never leave him, not ever. To leave him would be to prove the world right, that she was just a heartless adventuress who had ruined him for sport. She had to stay. She had to make it work. She had to be happy. Her life depended on it. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor and the gilded cage. They were married on June 3rd, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. It was a small, sad, strangely defiant affair. The chateau was a beautiful Renaissance pile in the Loire Valley, lent to them by a sympathetic American friend. The groom's family was not there, not the new King George VI, not Queen Mary. Not a single member of the British royal family attended the wedding of the former king. The snub was deliberate and devastating. The guest list was a collection of sympathetic Americans and a few brave British friends who were willing to risk royal displeasure. Wallis wore a pale blue crepe dress by Manbochet, an American designer based in Paris. It was simple, elegant, and designed to project calm respectability. It was not the gown of a queen. It was the gown of a woman trying very hard not to be noticed. She was now the Duchess of Windsor, but the title was a poison pill. Her husband had been granted the title of Duke of Windsor, but Wallis was explicitly denied the style of Her Royal Highness by a vengeful royal family. It was a calculated, devastating insult, orchestrated largely by Queen Mary and the new Queen Elizabeth. In the arcane language of royal protocol, this meant that no one in the royal family had to curtsy to her. It meant that when they were in the presence of royalty, she was treated as a commoner. It meant she was his wife, but she was not one of them. It was a constant, daily reminder that she had won the man, but lost the world, and it gnawed at her for the rest of her life. She spent decades campaigning, quietly and through intermediaries, for the HRH title. She never got it. And here is where the true tragedy of Wallis Simpson begins to unfold. She had married a man who had given up a kingdom for her, and she discovered too late that he was a man with nothing else to give. Edward had no hobbies except golf and gardening. He had no intellectual curiosity. He had no friends except her. He was a man who had been king and was now reduced to complaining about the cut of his trousers, the temperature of his soup, or the fact that his brother wouldn't give him a proper job. He was obsessed with protocol, with the slights he perceived from the royal family. He spent hours every day on the telephone, gossiping with his few remaining friends, relitigating the abdication, complaining about his allowance. Wallis, who was razor-sharp, cultured, and loved stimulating conversation, was now stuck with a petulant, aging adolescent who followed her from room to room. She would be trying to read a book or write a letter, and he would appear in the doorway, asking what she was doing, demanding her attention. He couldn't bear to be in a different room from her. He suffocated her with his presence. And she smiled. She smiled because she had to. She smiled because the whole world was watching, waiting for her to slip, waiting for proof that the marriage was a sham. She smiled because she had told him she would make him happy, and she was a woman of her word. She kept up the facade. The Duchess of Windsor became a byword for chic. She was the best-dressed woman in the world, year after year. Her clothes were masterpieces of precision, made by Givenchy, Dior, and Mamboche. Her homes were shrines to perfection. Every surface gleamed. Every flower arrangement was a work of art. She changed for dinner every single night of her life, even if it was just the two of them and the pugs. Even when they were old and tired, she would descend the staircase in a couture gown and priceless jewels, and they would eat a quiet dinner in a dining room that could seat 50. But why? Why this obsessive devotion to appearances? It was the only thing she had left. She couldn't be queen. She couldn't be a mother. She couldn't have a career. She couldn't even have a private life without his constant, suffocating presence. So she controlled the things. She controlled the orchids on the table and the seam of her gloves. She controlled the guest list and the menu and the temperature of the wine. She created a world of such rigid, beautiful order that it became a prison. And she was the warden, but she was also the inmate. They became a joke in high society, the Duke endlessly reminiscing about his brief reign, the Duchess rolling her eyes and correcting his pronunciation of French words. She was his jailer as much as he was hers, and the isolation was crushing. The business of being Wallis and the loneliness of exile. The decades passed with the slow, grinding rhythm of a luxury cruise ship that never reaches port. The 1940s and 1950s saw the Windsors become a fixture of international café society. They were photographed at El Morocco in New York, at galas in Palm Beach, at parties on the French Riviera. They were the guests of millionaires and, more troublingly, of dictators. Their infamous visit to Nazi Germany in 1937, where they were feted by Hitler and high-ranking Nazi officials, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was a propaganda coup for the Nazis, and it cemented the British establishment's view of the Windsors as not just embarrassing, but potentially dangerous. During the war, Edward was shunted off to the Bahamas as governor, a post that Wallis referred to as being sent to the Elba of the Caribbean. It was a demotion, a way for the British establishment to keep him out of trouble and away from Europe. Wallis threw herself into the work of colonial hospitality, redecorating the governor's mansion and trying to make the best of a humiliating situation. But the snubs continued. The local British aristocrats in Nassau refused to call on her. The wives of British officers would not curtsy. She was the governor's wife, but she was still the woman who broke the Church of England. She was still the outcast. Their life was funded by an allowance from the royal family, an allowance that was always a source of tension and bitter negotiation. Edward complained constantly about money, about not being treated fairly by his brother, about the cost of maintaining their lifestyle. He kept meticulous accounts of his expenses, while simultaneously spending lavishly on jewelry for Wallis. The jewelry was a language. It was his apology for the life she had lost. The famous Cartier flamingo brooch, the sapphire bracelet with the inscription, "For our first anniversary," the Van Cleef and Arpels zip necklace that was a marvel of engineering, the onyx and diamond panther bracelet. She amassed one of the greatest jewelry collections in the world, and she wore it like armor. She wore it to luncheons and to dinners, and to evenings spent alone with him watching television. She wore it because underneath the jewels, there was a woman who was profoundly, achingly bored and alone. She had no real friends, only acquaintances who wanted to be seen with the Duchess. She had no children. She had no country. She had only Edward. And as the years wore on, Edward's health declined. He was frail, his eyesight was failing from cataracts, and he became even more dependent on her. She managed his medications. She arranged his schedule. She cut his food for him. She became, in the end, not a wife, but a full-time nurse. She had spent her youth seeking security, and now she was the security for a man who had become a helpless, elderly child. And she did it all with the same precision she had applied to everything else in her life. She never complained, not publicly. She had made her bed, a very expensive, very beautiful bed, and she would lie in it until the end, the final act, and the quiet room in Paris. Edward, Duke of Windsor, died on May 28, 1972. He had been ill with throat cancer, a painful, lingering death. He had been a heavy smoker all his life, and the cancer had taken its toll. Wallis had cared for him to the bitter end. She had been the strong one, the one who arranged the funeral, the one who flew to England to bury him at Frogmore, the one who stood rigid and small next to a queen who had despised her for 40 years. Queen Elizabeth II, the daughter of the man whose life had been upended by the abdication, was gracious but distant. She allowed Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace for the funeral. It was a display of protocol, not warmth. The Queen Mother, the woman who had called her that woman for decades, was there. The air was thick with decades of unspoken resentment. Wallis, dressed in black, her face a mask of composure, stood by the grave and watched the coffin of the man who had given up the world for her being lowered into the ground. The last 14 years of her life were a descent into a silence that the earlier photographs never hinted at. She lived in the same grand house, now empty of his chatter, his complaints, his constant needy presence. She became a recluse. Her health, both physical and mental, deteriorated rapidly. She suffered from dementia, that cruel thief of memory. She became bedridden, unable to speak coherently, unable to recognize the few friends who still came to visit. She was cared for by a French lawyer, Maître Suzanne Blum, a formidable woman who took control of Wallis's affairs, and who was accused by many of isolating the Duchess and selling off her possessions for her own benefit. It was a sad, sordid end to a life that had been lived so publicly. The woman who had conquered a king, who had been the best-dressed woman on the planet, who had dined with Nazis and presidents, was now a frail, tiny figure in a darkened room, her hair unkempt, her famous jewels locked away. She was unable to speak, unable to remember the whirlwind she had caused. The jewelry sat locked in a safe. The gowns hung in closets, preserved in tissue paper like shrouds. There were no visitors. There were no parties. There was just the ticking of a clock and the fading memory of a love that had cost her everything. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. She was buried next to Edward at Frogmore. It was a simple ceremony, a quiet end to a noisy life. The royal family attended out of duty, not love. She was finally back in England, not as a queen, not as a royal highness, but as a relic of a scandal that the family had long ago decided to forget. Her gravestone reads simply, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. The title she fought so hard for, the title that was denied her in life, was given to her in death. She got the king, she got the jewels, she got the fairy tale. But the fairy tale ended the moment the I-do's were spoken, because after the king gave up his kingdom, there was nothing left for him to do but watch her, and nothing left for her to do but be watched. And in the end, the woman who took a king was left alone in a gilded cage, with nothing but the echo of her own, carefully curated silence. The romance of the century was, in reality, a life sentence, and Wallis Simpson served every last day of it.